Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. My name is Angela King. I am the local host of Morning Edition on KUOW 94.9 Seattle, and we would like to welcome you to the second event in our new KUOW series, The First 100 Days. We are chronicling the first 100 days of the Biden-Harris administration. Now, joining us for these conversations are leading NPR and BBC correspondents, including NPR's Anya Kamenetz, the BBC's Anthony Zurcher, and NPR's Scott Horsley. We're going to explore top issues facing the new administration, and there are a lot of them, as we all know, from COVID-19 to the economy, to education, immigration, U.S. relations. The list goes on and on, so you get the idea. By the way, each event is free, and it will be streamed on KUOW's YouTube channel. So for our virtual audience today, welcome. So glad to have you. And we would love to hear from you during this conversation. So please, you can share your questions, your comments in our comments section. I'll be monitoring them throughout the show, and we will get to as many of your questions as possible. I know there are a lot of them out there, especially given the topic that we are looking at today. And we are talking about education. And we know this is a big one. And joining us today is NPR's national correspondent for education, Anya Kamenetz. Anya, it is so great to have you, and thank you for your time.
Oh, thanks for having me, Angela.
All right, well, let's just put this plainly. It's not like the past 4 to 5 years haven't been interesting enough. In 2016, if we can even remember back that far, some of the top issues were charter schools, race-conscious admissions, student debt. I guess that topic never really goes away. But one of the most dominating ones right now, if not the most dominating topic, is no matter where you go, when will schools reopen and how? So let's just get right into it as we take a look at this. Let me just say to you first, what a year to have the education beat. Since we've been talking about the president's first 100 days in office, how have these first 100 days been for you as the national education correspondent?
It's never a dull moment. I think for education reporters, I'll speak for myself, we are always very convinced of the newsworthiness of our stories and the fact that we've got 20 million college students in the country, 55 million K-12 students in the country. It's just a lot of people, but this was the year that this captured the nation's imagination and attention. And I think we see this in federal policy. We see it in the pronouncements. Biden calling school reopening a national emergency, CDC releasing new guidelines on school reopening, and then the American Rescue Plan today with $130 billion with a B dollars almost for K-12 education. And, that is a lot of money. Mostly we're used to saying the federal government normally puts in about a dime for every dollar of education funding in the US. So it is local control all the way. But this is a real infusion of cash. And behind that, of course, is a big message about what he wants schools to do.
So can you break down that cash flow? Are there any areas where this money is earmarked specifically to go toward?
Sure. I mean, across the board, of course, there's an existing Title I structure, which has to do with high poverty schools. There's a lot of interest in equity. We see, of course, that there are many, many kids that have been left behind in this pandemic, either because of the digital divide, because they are not engaged with learning. They may have to work to support their families. They may be taking care of younger siblings. They may simply not be able to be observed for learning at home. Maybe their parents have language barriers that prevent them from facilitating online learning. All of these reasons, we're very worried about kids needing extra attention to catch up. There's earmarked funds in there for tutoring, for summer school, for social and emotional learning, hiring counselors, for the kids that really have been suffering from a lack of social contact. And honestly, just losses. I mean, the whole country is in mourning and our kids are feeling that.
Yeah, and that's an important thing to bring up because I think in the crush of just the daily grind for parents, for families, we forget that these children as well have lost loved ones. And it is a hard time for everyone, and it is hard to keep up with everything. So let me ask you, what topics do you specifically check on or look for every day?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that I have been increasingly focused on, if you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I'm interested in food, clothing, and shelter because we know that there's been this unprecedented uptick in child hunger, and part of that is because of the suspension of the school food program. So I look at the kids that are on the margins. I am wondering now about how are we going to find them? I'm looking at kids in the juvenile justice system, who are migrants, kids who are homeless or unstably housed, and how do we surface them and get them back into education? And then the social and emotional needs, which are across the board. I don't care how privileged you've been in this pandemic. If you're a mom or dad, there's been a moment where you've been worried about your kids' mental well-being because this is just a challenge like no other. And learning, of course, we worry about learning. We worry about the personalization. I'm very curious we just did a poll with Ipsos where we found 29% of parents said they were likely or very likely to continue remote learning indefinitely.
Well, we're going to get into that topic a little bit later on, but you brought up the fact that a lot of our kids are still out of school, and in fact, it's been about a year, almost to the day for some school districts, that they've just not been in session full time. And one of the first school districts in our region and actually in the country to basically shut down in terms of having no kids in the classroom was the North Shore School District right here in Western Washington. And it is now in the process of reopening schools. I believe students will start returning. Some of the younger students will start returning on March 22nd. But since this whole year has kind of been a whirlwind, can you remind us in what state did the first school district try to reopen amid the pandemic, and how have things been going there thus far?
It's so curious to hear you say that because the national picture has been so different in different places. The first districts that opened up were actually back in May before the pandemic even reached its peak in Montana and Wyoming, right? In these very rural areas where they hadn't had a lot of cases, they started opening up in a limited way and bringing kids back. And then we saw in the fall, obviously, some of the governors, this became so politicized, if you recall, there were big calls from Trump to reopen schools. And there's been studies that have shown that there's a correlation between Trump support and schools reopening. So we saw that the big districts in Texas and Georgia, in Florida, really pushed aggressively for the full reopening, and not even sometimes without masks, sometimes without social distancing. And so there's just this divergence that's happened, and there's been these patterns of closures and reopenings throughout the country. Now in the spring here, it's only about 1 in 4 students, according to the organization Burbio, that have not darkened the doors of a classroom this whole time. So most places there's either been some full-time, which is the kind of gung-ho states, or some part-time, some hybrid. And there's obviously differences, rural, suburban, or urban, but this is a big country and we have local control of schools. So whether we're always going to arrive at a bunch of different places with this.
Well, are there any states or school districts in your reporting that have gotten it right up to this point?
I can definitely say that there's a template of success that has to do with smaller districts with a lot of community support, with strong ties between the students and the community. And honestly, the resources to follow CDC guidelines and the mentality in the area to wear masks. I mean, it hasn't been seamless anywhere, because when you open and the surges that we've seen over this year, most places have had to close either on the school level, the district level, or the city level for some period of time because of cases and small outbreaks. But in terms of numbers of days of learning throughout the year without too many interruptions and without too many cases, I think we are seeing bright spots around the country. It takes trust and it takes a lot of luck, I think.
And luck being a key indicator there, key phrase there. I would second that. How about our college students? What is data saying about their return to campus?
It's super interesting. Colleges have gone so many different paths. I think with colleges, there is a bigger bigger body of evidence that they have led, unfortunately, to outbreaks in many places. And that's because you have a concentration of teens and 20 somethings, right, in a town. And even if they're not in the classroom together, the question is, what is their behavior outside the classroom? And is it able to be controlled? So some schools have done very well. My colleague Alyssa Nadworny is, right now reporting in Miami on schools that are canceling their spring breaks and trying to be responsible. But then there are schools that haven't done so well. So again, it's a very mixed bag.
Yes, and especially when you talk about college students not only being 20 somethings, we've seen some outbreaks here locally at one of our state universities, the University of Washington, specifically on Greek Row. Are you seeing outbreaks specifically tied to these type of social groups? And forgive me in calling a fraternity or a sorority a social group, but I think I'm just kind of painting a broad picture for our listeners.
I think loosely speaking, there have been outbreaks traced to, bars and restaurants that are near campuses, to parties that are near campuses. It's very hard, I think, because obviously this is a population that tends to not be as seriously affected by COVID. And sometimes there's mixed messages that they're getting as far as, am I staying home to keep myself safe, or is it to keep someone else safe? And can you really draw boundaries, especially in a small, densely populated community, between people of different risk profiles? I think it's a very, very tricky thing to negotiate. Some schools have done very well, though, I have to say. Again, I mean, there have been schools that have gone through the semester with few outbreaks. So it is a lot of it is about messaging and cohesion, as well as the resources to do a lot of testing and a lot of treatment of students.
Yes, and we're going to talk about testing a little bit later on as well. But just on a personal note, can I ask you this? Can you remember back to when all of this first started? Did you think, or could you have imagined COVID still interrupting the daily lives of students, parents, and teachers the way it is right now?
I would never have imagined it lasting this long for so many students. I'll have to say, Angela, that it brought me back because I'm from New Orleans originally, and I had been on the ground right after Katrina and during that school year and reporting on what happened. And I knew that even for, it was just a few short weeks for those students, the displacement and data has shown had a massive impact on their educations that lasted for years. In some cases, it completely stopped them from continuing on in their educations. And New Orleans took a hit in high school graduation and college going rates. So I knew it was going to last a long time in terms of the legacy of that interruption, but I was only thinking of it in terms of 9 or 10 weeks.
Wow. That's a wonderful perspective, in the sense that we've dealt with things that have affected our student populations before, but for this to continue going on. In fact, our largest school district here in Washington State is still trying to figure out how to get teachers and students back into the classroom safely, but of course, not without a lot of controversy. I mean, emotions are impassioned from every person who has a stake in all of this. And one group other than the students themselves, and we're going to get into some of those issues and concerns facing them in just a bit, but let's talk about teachers right now. Within the first 100 days in office, President Biden laid down this gauntlet for school districts to reopen.
Let me be clear. We can reopen schools if the right steps are taken, even before employees are vaccinated. But time and again, we've heard from educators and parents that have anxieties about that. So as yet another move to help accelerate the safe reopening of our schools, let's treat in-person learning like an essential service that it is. And that means getting essential workers who provide that service, educators, school staff, child care workers, get them vaccinated immediately. They're essential workers.
And the president said he wanted teachers to get at least one shot of the COVID vaccine before the end of March. And this leads me to an audience question out there. This person asks, right now, teachers are being assured that it is safe to go back for a full day. I am worried we are going to see a perfect storm of a more deadly COVID outbreak in our state, with thousands of children crowding onto buses, into hallways. We are told that it's safe, and teachers are scared that they are going to get sick. Now, we are almost in the middle of the month of March, and it's probably too early for there to be any national data out there about how many teachers have been vaccinated against COVID. But have you seen anything in your reporting when it comes to teachers getting infected after they re-enter the classroom?
So I want to be very careful here. I'm not a medical expert, right? And it's not my job to, give more than my interpretation of. Because they don't trust.
What the?
And trust has been such a big issue, especially given the divided nature of our nation that has just been exacerbated over the past 4 to 5 years. We want to remind our audience out there watching that we are taking your questions. If you have any specific questions for Anya Kamenetz, please leave that in the comment section and we will get to that as soon as possible. And just taking a look at the situation here in Washington State, the State Health Department recently released data that showed between August and December, 305 cases were tied to outbreaks in 84 schools. Most of the outbreaks were small, involving 2 or 3 cases. Does that seem to be the case in what you're seeing nationwide or what your reporting has uncovered?
I mean, I'll refer to the CDC data. They've released several studies and reviews of evidence showing that cases in schools when there's masking and there's distancing are actually lower than cases in the community. And in the study of the districts in Wisconsin, it was found that they were having a massive rampant spread in the community of COVID, and they had almost no cases within the school because of their adherence to the guidelines. So I think that, that is what the basis of the CDC guidance is, to say that even with very high community transmission, with the right safeguards in place, it should be possible to keep schools open, and starting with the elementary schools and starting with the hybrid model. And that's really what they're trying to recommend based on the evidence that we have so far.
Well, from teachers being exposed or being vaccinated, let's pivot to the students getting their shots. And whenever you talk about vaccinating children, you open a huge controversial box, especially with so-called anti-vaxxers. Now, that's a whole different topic. We don't have time to get into that today. But what about kids getting vaccinated? Let's listen to what Dr. Anthony Fauci recently had to say about that.
High school kids will likely have availability by the fall of this year, but it is anticipated that you won't have the younger elementary school and below children getting vaccine until at least the first quarter of 2022.
Wow. So Anya, it sounds like either way, it's going to be a while before students, younger children, can get their shots. We've also heard the CDC say children are not good spreaders of the coronavirus. Now, as you have deferred to the CDC's reporting, and we understand you are not a doctor, is there any new research out there explaining why children are basically not good spreaders?
So the explanations that I've heard from the beginning have been, first of all, people that are good spreaders are tend to be people who have symptoms. Now we see a lot of spread among, it's confusing because asymptomatic people, no symptoms, can't do a lot of spreading, but the reason they do so much spreading is that they don't know they have it, right? So they're not taking precautions. Symptomatic people are a lot better at spreading because they are putting forth those droplets, the coughs, the sneezes. And young children are so unlikely to have symptomatic infections that they are less likely then to transmit the virus. That seems to be the major explanation that's been put forward.
All right. Well, from the virus to the variants, we are seeing a rise in that. What is the data showing when it comes to how that might affect the thought process of reopening schools?
Well, I think that, we are learning more about these variants. They do seem to be more transmissible, but none of them are powerless against our weapons that we've had since the beginning of the pandemic, which are masking, distancing, hand washing, ventilation. And none of them are powerless against the vaccines. So the prescription seems to be the same, which is watch the numbers in the community and let those be your guide as long as you're doing adequate testing. Those should be your guide as to whether you can continue to operate safely. If you start to see spikes, that's when you start to think about, okay, do we drop down from full-time to hybrid or from hybrid to remote, based on, again, the community transmission and the zones that the CDC has put forward.
And a lot of states following that guideline, of course, or those guidelines, I should say, here in Washington State. The governor has said that school districts should consider those rates of infection if you are seeing spikes to bring shut down some in-person learning. We've not seen that yet, in large part because a lot of our students are still not in the physical classroom. We are looking at the first 100 days of education under the Biden administration with NPR's national education correspondent, Anya Kamenetz. Please send us your questions, type them in the comments section below, and we will get to as many as we possibly can in the remaining 35 minutes of our discussion. So Anya, another big issue facing students and families, and it's something that you mentioned earlier, is just the stress of all of this. It's a broad question, but what has the mental toll been on students?
Oh my gosh, where to begin? I think there is the loss of routine. So for many teenagers, it's a disruption in sleep patterns. It's a sedentary lifestyle. The kids are not eating well. They're eating out of boredom all day long. Of course, there's also families that are food insecure. That's very stressful. The economic stress on parents is transferred onto the kids. The lack of boundaries between home and work. Parents can't be their best selves. They feel that they're failing their kids. For children, obviously they need to be with their friends, and the older kids get, the young children, you can feel like they have mommy and daddy and they're okay in the household by themselves. The older kids get, the more important peers are to their development, and the sadder they get, the more depressed they get when they can't be around their peers and they're isolated. And then we see a lack of the other developmental needs that teens have, which are risk, excitement, a sense of purpose, a sense of meaning, status, achievement in their lives. All of these are very, very difficult right now. And that's where we get kids really saying, this is so meaningless. I don't feel like I can go on. And the expression of that, I'll just tell you very personally, and this is totally anecdotally, the number of people that are coming to me, friends and sources, and saying, my kid said they don't want to live anymore, is absolutely beyond. And I hope that part of it is that we feel okay to talk about it. There's not a stigma anymore. Everyone's going through something. And, I have referred more friends to mental health professionals than I can count. I've also had mental health professionals come to me as a reporter and say, cold call me and say, Anya, you got to do a story on this because the teens are not doing well.
Is there one story in particular that has stuck with you?
Yeah, I think about this all the time, and I did report on this. It was a family, they're both teachers. So they went home, they have 3 kids. Their students are in need. It's a high need school. So they're dealing with student help, requests for help all day long, all night long, because the school decided that the students can turn in their assignments up to 11:59 p.m. and still have them graded the next day. They're trying to grant grace to the students. So these parents are giving it their all, and they're helping their kids also homeschooling. The middle child, he's sometimes homeschooling until midnight, not till midnight, after dinner. They discover that he's not eating. He's chewing up his food and putting it in the trash. This is his expression of despair as a 7-year-old, that he can't play soccer and can't be with his friends.
That's heartbreaking. I know a lot of parents out there are reacting the same way I am. I'm sure the way you did when you heard about that story. How hard is it to hold it together when you are talking to families about issues and topics so sensitive, so personal, so intimate and scary?
Thank you for asking. I think we've all grown a lot this year, and I feel grateful to be able to be of service every day. And sometimes that means you're holding someone's trauma, and you have to grant yourself that space and that permission to say, yeah, it's a lot. But ultimately, I feel so lucky because it's that sense of meaning. And, I can't say, Angela, that every day is like the day before. They're all different.
Oh, absolutely. Well, you talked about teenagers, and, kids are missing their proms, student activities, sports, scholarship opportunities, and of course, there are the academic concerns. Let's take a look at one example here from King 5 News' Chris Daniels.
Another day, another empty school, whether it be in Seattle or down the road in Skyway.
I want my kids to be back in school, and I want, of course, our life to get back to normal.
Josephine Quigtar says her 2 sons, aged 16 and 8, have struggled in the remote learning environment.
It's been really difficult. It's been very difficult. It's a loss. A lot of the learning comes from interacting with his peers and face-to-face time with his teacher.
So Washington State is lagging way at the bottom among the nation getting kids back to school.
Lee Fina is the director of the Center for Education at the conservative Washington Policy Center.
The equity question is enormous. We have low-income minority children that are already way behind their peers in the public schools, and now they are even further behind.
She points to this aggregating data site, which puts Washington at 47th in the country, with under 20% of kids back in class. State data actually has a higher percentage at 28.3%, which is still a small number when compared with the rest of the country.
It's an emergency. It's an education emergency that we're facing.
And since that report from Chris Daniels came out, statewide here in Washington, about 37% of students here are receiving some form of in-person learning. So Anya, folks are worried about our kids falling behind. Is there any research or any idea as to when we can expect to see that type of data come in?
Yeah, the Biden administration has sent a message that they want states to conduct some sort of testing. It could be in the spring or in the summer. And this is something that has caused some controversy because nobody loves those tests. But there is a feeling that there needs to be some kind of data and some kind of, I don't know if I even want to call it accountability. There's a reckoning process that goes on here. And I'll say, I spoke to a first grade teacher for a story last week, and she said, on the one hand, if you push the kids too hard beyond what they can do, they're just shut down. But if you go too easy on them, they'll never rise to that occasion. So we have all had a setback, and we also can't lose sight of learning standards, age-based learning standards, they can be quite arbitrary. The question is, and this is something our school system's never been very good at, how do you create learning standards that are customized and appropriate to each child for where they are now and what they've had to overcome to get here?
Well, my mom is a retired teacher, and she says a lot of parents are seeing for the first time what it really takes to teach children and to get them to focus, hone in, like you say, to feel motivated, to feel like, how far do you push them? You don't want to push them over the edge, but you don't want to let them just slide off of the radar. But that question becomes very pronounced when we are talking about inequities.
Yes.
And racial inequities being a large one. Another issue, and we're going to get into racial inequities in just a moment here, but what about access to the internet? We had a question from one of our listeners, Betty's on YouTube, and she said, I'm curious about the digital divide to underserved areas. Is the problem that there is no broadband infrastructure into some of our neighborhoods, or that families can't afford the service, or is it a combination of both? What are you seeing in your reporting?
All of the above. Rural access to broadband is a very real problem. There have been obviously lots of attempts, including by the large carriers like Comcast, to give low-cost Wi-Fi to families. There's hotspots that use the mobile network. All of them have glitches, especially if you have multiple children, plus maybe some adults who are all trying to use the connection to work and to go to school. Very easy for that to get overloaded and interrupted. There's equipment issues. Sometimes there's compatibility issues. Districts, gotta love them. They've scrambled and they're working here and there. And there were, backlogs of things like Chromebooks, especially in the spring, to get the right equipment to the right kids to be able to use them. So yeah, it's been an extraordinary effort, but I think certainly gaps remain all across the board.
Well, like one of many of NPR's news stations or member stations, KUOW is uncovering some different aspects when it comes to these topics of inequities, stress, the mental health of students. Here's our education reporter, Ann Dornfeld, followed by Sabrina Burr. She is a longtime Seattle community and education advocate. And Gerald Donaldson, a Leschi Elementary School family support worker. All three recently spoke to KUOW's Bill Radke on the Record, which is KUOW's midday show.
The most recent district survey showed that parents of white students tended to be more eager to send their kids back to school now than parents of BIPOC children. That is similar to what we've seen play out across the country. There are a lot of reasons for that from families I've spoken to. Some families have one reason, some have all of them. One is that BIPOC families are more likely to live in intergenerational households, or they might have family in the area they want to keep safe. BIPOC families are also more likely to have conditions like asthma that can lead to more severe outcomes from COVID, even among children. But along with those virus concerns, a lot of families of color have told me that their kids really didn't always feel safe or welcome at school, even before COVID.
A lot of Black children, especially mine, are absolutely thriving. In our schools, there's a lot of racism and microaggressions that our kids have to navigate through. And right now, our kids are being able to show up as their whole self. A lot of parents are really understanding the brilliance and how their students learn. And when you have schools like Cleveland, whose instructors are amazing, my daughter is doing extremely well. Her molecular biology class has her understanding more about COVID and the vaccinations. Even her math teacher is still talking about people of Black backgrounds and heritage that are contributed in STEM. And so for me, I think it's gotten richer.
Some of our families are, we have a high homeless population. So when they go to school, they don't look like other students just by their appearance, what they're wearing. So now that's not even an issue, right? They can thrive in that. They're not being teased or talked about sometimes. And it happens enough where it gets onto you where it messes with your psyche, right? Mm-hmm. And so if that doesn't happen, if you're not in that situation, it does make it better for you to learn.
This is an opportunity to do strong family engagement and truly partner with families. We have a lot of walls within our education system. And like Angela Davis says, a wall turned sideways is a bridge. And we need to be creating bridges. This is an opportunity. I don't think we'll ever go back to school like it was. And people are excited to go back to school. But what does that look like? Are we even preparing our students for what new school will look like?
And that segues perfectly into a question we just received from Bridget on YouTube. She asks, do you feel that how COVID has blown up education will kickstart a new way of looking at age-based or grade-based requirements?
I think this is just such a fundamental challenge to the whole way that school is structured. You're hearing and the complexities of this. I love that you're doing, this local reporting that captures this. It's different in every community and for every family, honestly. And the duality of school, on the one hand, People have written for a long time about the coercive nature of our public schooling. It's been a battleground for civil rights. It's been a place that people have worked hard to have access to. It's been seen as the crucible of our democracy. How are people going to come together as a society if we don't have that, melting pot of citizenship that is schooling? At the same time, how can we ask some of our students to come to school if they're going to be made to feel other, less than, because of circumstances they have no control over? Why shouldn't they be in the bosom of their family and be celebrated and upheld and learn according to what they want to learn? So these are conversations, Angela, we've been having since this country was founded. Absolutely. Can we build a public school system that serves the kids that kids want to go to, that makes their lives better, not something that they have to endure?
Well, this discussion we're having right now is generating a lot of questions from our audience. This is from Travis on YouTube. He asks, is the value of sending kids back for a couple of months enough to outweigh chaos the transition will bring for teachers, or should we focus on finishing strong and going back to school in person this fall?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I mean, it's not my personnel decision to make. I will say that opening up school is like riding a bike. The longer you wait, the harder it is. Districts that got it going back in the fall have had a lot more time to perfect the process and to iron out the wrinkles and to handle the issues that come up. If you push it off even more into the fall again, you're going to continue to weaken those ties between families and communities and their schools. You're going to weaken the school going relationships and habits. People are going to, continue to kind of wonder, is this where I want to be right now? Or can I, come up with something else? There's the families that are set on coming back in person are going to have to look for another option. And I see families doing that. I see families peeling off in districts that have stayed closed all this time. They're looking for the parochial school, the private school, the homeschool alternative. So there's a lot of things to consider beyond what is, yes, going to be chaotic and disruptive, no matter when you do it.
And you talk about students or families seeking other forms of education or other educational opportunities. That has got to have school districts worried, because a lot of their financing and the money is based on how many students are actually enrolled.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, the enrollment drops are very real. Some of them seem to be based on kindergarten admissions because that's the easiest year to kind of keep kids out and it's not compulsory to enroll them. So then the question becomes, what do we have next year? Do we have extra big first rate classes, or do we have some kids kids doing kindergarten again a year later? And then how do you fund that? How do you plan for that? I think that's still a really big question.
Well, we were just listening to, prior to these audience questions, at least the listeners' questions, about how some students may feel more comfortable being at home, learning remotely. Are there any other side effects you're seeing when it comes to kids not being in the physical classroom?
That's an interesting question. I would say that kids have very different needs, right? And so in terms of what the physical classroom provides, there are certainly students who do better in the sensory environment of their own home because of maybe they have ADHD or they have autism or other issues. There are students who need to move around when they're learning, and they can't do that in a classroom that's crowded without disrupting others. At the same time, there are limitations to the socially distanced classroom in terms of group work or sharing materials or really kind of interactive teaching. So a lot of teachers are kind of lamenting that, they are happy to have in-person learning, but it doesn't necessarily do everything that they used to be able to do in a full classroom. So these trade-offs, I think, are going to be with us for a little while unless we really turn a corner with the pandemic.
Well, another issue that's come up that doesn't deal directly with education, rather it deals with teachers having eyes on students in the classroom. Teachers and counselors are often the first ones to report signs of abuse. What is the research saying about that?
Well, what's happening with that is we're staring into a data void because we have a lack of reports of child abuse. And that's because of the lack of access. That's assumed to be because of the lack of access to these mandatory reporters. And then there are some reports of looking at emergency room admissions that children who do come in have more severe injuries. So it's very troubling. It is a struggle for everyone I've spoken to in the child welfare system to try to figure out how we're going to reach these kids, and how we're going to make sure that they're safe. I'm sure it's weighing on the minds of many, many people that have contact with kids.
Yes. Lots of people have a big stake in schools reopening. Teachers, parents, superintendents, custodians, bus drivers, moms and dads trying to figure out how they can go back to work, let alone paying for childcare when they maybe have lost their job. Because let's just be frank and honest, kids in school helps parents go to work. And now we're asking, at what cost? So let's pivot to let's pivot on a personal level. And I hope you don't mind me asking you this, but you're a parent. How have you been handling all of this?
Well, we're very fortunate. We have a lot of resources here in New York City. Our 4-year-old is in a private preschool, so she stayed one more year in the private system instead of switching to the public pre-K. And that's been running as normal since July. So they've had no outbreaks, and it's been just incredible for her to be able to see her friends and her teachers. They're all used to wearing masks. My 9-year-old is learning from home. And then the question becomes, how do we get safe social contact for her and safe activities? So, it's basically parks, it's outdoors in all weather, trying to plan play dates with friends where we know what their families are doing and that they're keeping safe, and trying to make sure that she, has outdoor time every day that's my watchword. Not too much time on the video games.
Yeah, and that's another big issue, is just monitoring the screen time. I tip my hat to all parents out there right now trying to figure out the best way to just get through day-to-day life. It's rough.
It's a learning opportunity every single day, and it is parents know that they're not alone, and we can see the light at the end of the tunnel. So at least there's that.
Always focus on the positive where you can find it. We are looking at the first 100 days of education under the Biden administration, and joining us to help us do that is National Education Correspondent Anya. Kamenetz. Please send us your questions, type them in the comment section, and we will get to them in the time we have remaining in the program. And, as I mentioned, COVID is the big topic, of course, in everyone's life. It's just bled into everything, including education. But it's not the only education issue facing the Biden administration. And that brings me to this audience question, or a question from one of our viewers. What is the latest from the Biden administration on funding student loan debt? And let's remind everyone of where several Democrats and the Biden administration stood at the beginning of the year.
Long before COVID-19 ravaged our country, put so many New Yorkers and others out of work, people across the country have been crushed by the overwhelming loan burden that they've had. This debt holds people back from buying cars, from going on vacations, from starting families, from getting the job they want to get. It's a huge anchor on our entire economy, and there's very little that the president could do with the flick of a pen that would boost our economy more than canceling $50,000 in student debt.
We understand that this president knows his ability to use authority under the Higher Education Act to cancel student debt. And in fact, that is obvious because he has used that same authority to pause student loan payments and the accrual of interest. Now he must go further.
We need at least a $50,000 minimum. What will you do to make that happen?
I will not make that happen.
And the president, very blunt in that town hall with CNN. So where does the Biden administration, Anya, stand on this issue at this point in the first 100 days of the Biden-Harris administration?
So student loan forgiveness was really brought to the forefront in the 2016 race by Bernie Sanders, and then taken up again by Sanders and Warren in this primary race. So it was never a Biden pet issue. The question has been interestingly, now Schumer, obviously is the majority leader, joined with Warren in calling for this to be an executive action. So because loans are made and guaranteed by the Education Department, there is a question, there's an assertion by some legal authorities that Biden, with the stroke of a pen, could forgive this debt. So erase up to $50,000 in debt per borrower. And I think that gained some momentum as an idea when we didn't know if we were going to have when the Democrats didn't know if they were going to have the Senate, right? Before the Georgia runoffs, it was like, well, what can Biden do without the Senate? Well, here's something he could do without the Senate. He could do this huge stimulus, right? And it would be a stimulus. It'd be a middle-class stimulus. These are people getting started with their lives, trying to buy houses and start families. And, the counterpoint to that argument has always been that it is inherently not a progressive stimulus because college degrees are not evenly distributed across the population. People with college debt, a lot of them have college degrees, and they are proportionally more privileged. Ironically, forgiving a smaller amount of debt could be more progressive because there are folks who have maybe a few community college credits. They're shy of a degree, or they have for-profit college credits. And we know that for-profit colleges tend to target working class and Black people and also veterans, which is a whole other story. So if you writing off 10,000 could be a little more progressive than writing off 50,000. But Biden hasn't shown a lot of interest in this. He said that he wants the Congress to take it up. And so whether it gains momentum past this first, legislative session is kind of anyone's guess.
Okay. Well, let's listen to this one story outlining how tough it is to pay back that student loan debt.
Paying off my student loans feels like being stuck on a hamster wheel because you realize that you're just paying into interest incessantly and you're not making a dent in paying it off.
Kara Kapp holds 2 degrees from Florida Atlantic University, has 3 kids, including 10-month-old Annie, and began with $30,000 in student loans.
My balance now is $28,000.
More than 44 million Americans are drowning in some $1.7 trillion in student debt, a number that's doubled in just the past decade. Nearly a third of borrowers are either in default, late, or stop making payments within 6 years.
So have you heard similar stories, Anya?
Oh, yes. I mean, my first book was called Generation Debt. It was all about this group of students who have money that they can never pay back and interest rates and balloon payments that just dog them forever. So, I don't want to discount the reality of that at all. The question is, what's the best way to build up the middle class? And would this one-time erasure of student loan debt, would that actually do it? Because college keeps getting more expensive. People keep going into college. They keep borrowing to pay for it. What do you do after that?
Well, you say more people are going into college, but given the pandemic, the effect it's had on enrollment, colleges, some are struggling just because the tuition dollars aren't coming in.
That's a very good point, and that you're very right to say that. So there has been an incredible drop in college enrollment, and it's led by community colleges, which really should trouble us because those are really the engines of the working class and advancement in our country. And they're located also in communities all over the country. So they're local economic engines as well. They prepare workers for high-tech industries. They're in your area in Seattle. They're really, really important to innovation, economic recovery, the new kind of infrastructure we're going to build with green energy. You need community college graduates for that. So there's money coming in the American Rescue Package for that it's exactly targeted only to public institutions. And I think that's part of Biden's kind of soft spot. We know his wife is a community college professor and has been for decades. So yeah, we'll see if it's enough, and they really have to recover from this as well as the students do as well.
Well, how were enrollment numbers at universities and colleges looking before the pandemic? I know a lot of students, just because the online opportunities are far more vast now than they were 10 years ago. Do you know if college enrollment numbers prior to the pandemic were maintaining a steady pace? Were they dropping off, picking up?
They were steady. I think what's especially troubling to people is that they tend to be countercyclical. People usually go back to school when the economy takes a nosedive. And that didn't happen this time because of all these other disruptions. The other thing I think it's important to keep an eye on for some parts of the higher ed world, international enrollment is very important. And not only the coronavirus shutdown, but also the immigration policies of the previous administration really took a penalty on students who were coming, whether they're coming from China, India, Iran, all really big countries that tend to send people here. And, that's something about sort of our diplomacy as a country too, because when people come and say, we have the best universities in the world and we're willing to pay for that education, we get the benefit of that. We get those STEM PhDs, we get engineers, we get entrepreneurs. And when we close our doors to those students, they're going to take their talent elsewhere.
Well, one measure for students to get into college has traditionally been the use of standardized test results. So remind us where the Biden administration stands on this issue. Has it changed within the first 100 days?
This is not something that federal policy has a whole lot to say about. What we have seen is that colleges and universities, partly in a response to the disruptions of the coronavirus pandemic, but also frankly, because they're worried about enrollment, they've been dropping those test requirements right and left. This has been a massive year for dropping the SAT and ACT. And in doing that, they are in sync with data that shows that the SAT and ACT do no better job of predicting success in college than actually high school grades. And sometimes they can be, inequitable in the results that they show. They tend to predict students, the affluence of a student's zip code almost better than anything else. So, I think it could be the start of a new era in terms of the amount of power that we've invested these standardized tests in, and wondering if there's better ways to figure out who gets a spot in college.
Well, before we wrap up our conversation, we have about 5 minutes left. We've covered so many issues. The bulk of our discussion, obviously, dedicated to COVID. But are there any stories out there, as the national education correspondent for NPR, that you are afraid or concerned about flying under the radar? What do we need to keep our eyes out for as parents, as community members, as teachers?
Oh, that's such a great question. Coronavirus is a massive global challenge, but it's not the only one. And the topic I spent a lot of time thinking about before the pandemic was the climate crisis, as well as big picture generally. Education is a statement about what we want our society to be about in the future. What do we want our students to know and be able to do? What capacities and capabilities do we want them to have? And so when we think about reconstructing and repairing from COVID, the question is, a lot of people are saying, we can't go back to normal. Normal wasn't good enough. What do we really want our schools to teach kids? What kinds of abilities do we want them to have? How compassionate and empathetic do we want them to be? How anti-racist do we want them to be? How committed to social change? How confident in speaking their voice? And how concerned for the earth and the various kinds of challenges that they're going to need science to overcome, engineering to overcome, leadership skills, community building skills. How good is our education system? And that includes parents. How good are all of us doing at preparing our kids for that?
And all of us being put to the test. And fortunate for us, we have Anya Kamenetz as the NPR National Education Correspondent, sharing her knowledge, and shedding some light on some really important issues that I know are at the forefront of parents' minds and teachers' concerns, and of course the kids themselves. So Anya, I really want to thank you for taking some time to share your expertise with all of our viewers here in the Seattle area. And anything else you would like to add before we sign off?
It was a genuine pleasure. Thank you so much, Angela.
All right. NPR National Correspondent Anya Kamenetz, thank you so much. And a big thanks to everyone in our audience tonight. If you are watching on YouTube today, please be sure to subscribe to the channel below. The first 100 days virtual event is Thursday, April the 15th. It's on U.S. Relations with KUOW's Paige Browning and the BBC's Anthony Zurcher. So to find out more or to RSVP for the next event, please go to KUOW.org/events. And again, thank you all for your time and your attention and your great questions as well. We hope you all have a wonderful evening.